The Center of the Cyclone by John C. Lilly. Chapter 2. Near-lethal accident. No experiment is a failure. In the use and misuse of LSD, one must be aware that if one has programs that are self-destructive, one must be extremely careful to have proper guidance and proper advice before, during, and after long sessions, because of the releasing quality of the pupation period caused by LSD. Programs below levels of awareness are released. In the usual state of consciousness, there are counter-programs working against those that are deadly. In the LSD state, the connections between these programs which ensure survival of the organism are loosened. During my second LSD session, a good deal of grief, anger, and guilt had been released. I had succeeded in breaking my emotional bonds with my wife during that session. This caused the release of a deadly program, though I was not aware of this until after I gave the speech and pushed the elevator button. In the weeks after being released from the hospital, I was able to reconstitute the amnesic period and recover what had happened. Apparently, I had gone to my hotel room, extremely lonely and grief-stricken, filled with guilt and in the grips of a program which I didn't recognize. The LSD session had loosened a lot of my defenses against this particular program. I am reluctant to go into the details of this episode because, as Freud said, one owes discretion to oneself and one's friends at some point. One owes discretion to oneself and one's friends at some point. I will give the biological organic details without all the personal psychological meanings to illustrate how an accident can be caused by a stored program taking over. While giving myself an antibiotic shot, by accident, I injected under my skin a foam made with a detergent. The syringe had residual detergent in it, which I failed to clean out. Somehow the bubbles had gotten into my circulation, passed through the lungs, and lodged in my brain, cutting off the circulation to very critical parts of my brain, including the visual cortex. I had then gone into immediate coma. Later, I struggled up from the depths of the coma, got to the telephone in the room, called the operator, who then sent up the house detective. I went into coma again. When the detective arrived, he asked me for the name of a friend in the hotel. With great effort, I could think only of a neurologist in Chicago at that point. Meanwhile, my head was pounding, and I thought that I'd blown a blood vessel in my brain. The pain was the most excruciating that I've ever experienced. I went into coma again and struggled back out of coma and named a friend who was in the hotel. He said later that when he arrived in the room, I was in a coma and it took him 6 hours to get an ambulance. Meanwhile, I was lying there on the hotel bed, and I remember very well the inside experience that occurred while I was in the so-called coma. The pounding headache, the nausea, and the vomiting that occurred forced me to leave my body. I became a focused center of consciousness and traveled into other spaces and met other beings, entities, or consciousnesses. I came across two who approached me through a large empty space and who looked, felt, and transmitted guiding and teaching thoughts to me. It's very hard to put this experience into words because there are no words exchanged. Pure thought and feeling was being transmitted and received by me, and these two entities I will attempt to translate into words what occurred. I am in a large empty place with nothing in any direction except light. There is a golden light permeating the whole space, everywhere, in all directions, out to infinity. I am a single point of consciousness, of feeling, of knowledge. I know that I am. That is all. It is a very peaceful, awesome, and reverential space that I am in. I have no body. I have no need for a body. There is no body. I am just I, complete with love, warmth, and radiance. Suddenly, in the distance, appear two similar points of consciousness, sources of radiance, of love, of warmth. I feel their presence. I see their presence. Without eyes, without a body, I know they are there. So they are there. As they move towards me, I feel more and more of each of them, interpenetrating my very being. They transmit comforting, reverential, awesome thoughts. I realize that they are beings far greater than I. They begin to teach me. They tell me I can stay in this place, that I have left my body, and that I can return to it if I wish. They then showed me what would happen if I left my body back there, an alternate path for me to take. They also show me where I can go if I stay in this place. They tell me that it is not yet time for me to leave my body permanently, that I still have an option to go back to it. They give me total and absolute confidence, total certitude in the truth of my being in this state. I know with absolute certainty that they exist. I have no doubts. There is no longer any need for an active faith. It just is that way, and I accept it. Their magnificent, deep, powerful love overwhelms me to a certain extent, but I finally accept it, and as they move closer, I find less and less of me and more of them in my being. They stop at a critical distance and say to me that at this time I have developed only to the point where I can stand their presence at this particular distance. If they came any closer, they would overwhelm me, and I would lose myself as a cognitive entity, merging with them. They further say that I separated them into two, because that was my way of perceiving them, but that in reality they are one in the space in which I found myself. They say that I insist on still being an individual, forcing a projection onto them as if they were two. They further communicate to me that if I go back to my body, as I develop further, I eventually would perceive the oneness of them and of me and of many others. They say that they are my guardians, that they have been with me before at critical times, and that in fact they are always with me, but that I am not usually in a state to perceive them. I am in a state to perceive them when I am close to the death of the body. In this state, there is no time. There is an immediate perception of the past, present, and future, as if in the present moment. I stayed in this state for many hours in earth time. Then I came back to my body in the hospital. I had another pain in my head and came out of the coma to find that they were injecting something into my carotid arteries at the neck. I immediately perceived that they were looking for a brain lesion, for bleeding into the brain by injecting a radio-opaque substance for X-rays. Once the pain was exhausted, I went back into the coma, returning to the two guardians. The next time that I returned to my body and awoke, I was in a hospital bed. The pain in my head was gone, but I could not see. There was a brilliant white sheet of light immediately in front of my eyes, filling my whole visual field. I could feel my body and move various parts. I found I was not paralyzed. I found that I could talk and that I could think clearly, so I realized the brain damage was not as extensive as I had feared. I thought, the guardians are right. I can stay in my body, but blind. I went through an intense grief reaction to having come back to a blind body, but I trusted the guardian's statement that I would be all right. I lay in the hospital bed reviewing my knowledge of neurology and of brain mechanisms, and I figured out that I was blind because of an irritative rather than a destructive lesion in my visual cortex. The guardians were right. I must wait and see how much of my vision was left when the irritation stopped, when the blinding white light was turned off. When the doctors came in and found me awake, we discussed my case. I still didn't know what had happened. I knew who I was, and when they told me where I was, I recognized the hospital. An ophthalmologist examined my eye grounds. He said that there was no visible lesion in my eyes. This relieved me very much. The irritation was not in the retina. It was in the brain. If it had been in the retina, there would be less hope for recovery. During the period of the great white light in front of my eyes, I experienced some new phenomena. First of all, I couldn't see any light in the room, whether it was day or night. The inside light was so bright that it made no difference at all what sort of patterns were coming into my eyes. When the ophthalmologist examined my eyes, I couldn't see his light, which was very bright. My central seeing computer was firing so strongly that outside stimulation coming in through my eyes could not influence the result. The inside observer was blinded only because of the information coming to him, wherever he is, from the visual cortex was so strong that any added stimulation from the periphery made no difference. All lines were busy all the time. This showed me that the observing systems in my large computer were not in the irritated visual cortex itself. I studied the great white light. I began to see new phenomena. As I lay on the bed in the hospital, various kinds of visions occurred. Suddenly I saw a green lawn, but the grass looked totally artificial, as if it were made of plastic. On this lawn there was a hole, out of which a snake came. The snake rose out of the hole straight into the air. Suddenly I laughed, because he was such an artificial man-made snake. The snake was constructed with a spring down his center and was covered with paper. His head was made of painted wood. His jaws were articulated around a single nail. Coming in from the right was a wooden bird, brilliantly painted, flapping his wooden wings and opening and closing his wooden beak. The snake rose up and bit the wooden bird with his wooden jaws. The whole episode occurred while I was in a very relaxed state, just watching it happen. I remembered that as a small boy, I had a wooden snake and a wooden bird, just like this. I suddenly realized that part of my memory storage system was firing and transmitting these pictures into the visual display part of my computer. As soon as I realized that this was a memory elaborated by my child's imagination, I began to laugh. As soon as I laughed, it disappeared. Then I relaxed, and various other animals came out of wood. Various other animals made out of wood appeared. When I was 2 to 3 years old, I had a wooden Noah's Ark. The animals became animated, moving about across artificial grass. One characteristic of all these movements was the hesitancy and the wobbliness of the movements, as if the child were imagining these animals and making them move. The child was creating this movement in his imagination and not doing so good a job of it. This characteristic wobbliness of the construction is apparently a property of the child brain of a much earlier time. Slowly, during the next 48 hours, the brilliance of the white light decreased. The childish visions disappeared, and in their place was a swarm of insect-like points of light and dark which moved across the visual field. I found I could program their direction of flight and their speed. When I thought They would move in a particular direction. Later, the swarm moved in that direction. My programming was ahead of what happened. I could think, now they will move to the right, and within a few seconds, they moved to the right. One puts a program into the computer, and the computer executes the program and generates the result with a delay between the time of intent and the time of carrying out the result. I found later that for a very complex program, this process can take up to 3 to 4 minutes. With the swarms of insect-like points, the delay was a few seconds. When the neurologist in charge came in during this period, I told him something of these visual displays that I was seeing, and he said, "Oh, you're hallucinating. Would you like to see a psychiatrist?" My reply was, "Please, this is not a psychiatric matter. This will give us some information about what parts of the brain have been irritated." I thought to myself, I should call one of my French neurological friends who understands the production of visual displays by irritation of various parts of the brain. This old tendency of medical people to attribute hallucinations only to mentally ill persons and to put down visual displays as hallucinations has bothered me for some years. I learned my lesson, however, and I didn't speak of these matters any further with any of the attending staff. The brilliant white light decreased in intensity after 18 hours. I was to the point where stimulation from the eyes could come through to me. The first time that I could see, I was in the middle of the night when a nurse came in to give me an injection. There was a single light on in the room, and through the fog of the remaining residual internal white light, I saw 2 round black circles and a foggy face behind them. I was looking at the face of the nurse, and I said to her, laughing with relief, "You look just like an owl." She said, "Oh, you see now." I said, "Yes." And she went out and she asked one of the doctors to come in and check my eyes. Within the next 24 hours, my vision came back almost totally intact. There were only 2 little spots below my fixation point, 1 in each eye, which didn't come back. Subsequent tests outlined these 2 missing places in my visual field. They turned out to be very small. The attending ophthalmologist said that they might recover during the next few weeks. This turned out not to be the case, and over the subsequent years, these 2 spots have remained to continuously remind me of the dangers that one can get into with this kind of experimentation. Even today, 5 years later, I have difficulty in reading columns of figures. The spots below the points of fixation, I do not see the figures coming up when I read them vertically. However, I can read horizontally quite easily. I was told to convalesce for the next 6 weeks, not to do a lot of reading, and to let my nervous system totally recover. A friend allowed me to stay at his house for some time. I went into the country and I spent the next 6 weeks recovering my strength. During this period of convalescence, I analyzed what had happened. I recovered most of my memories and rebuilt myself, my view of myself, and my view of where I wanted to go. It turned out that the experience with the guardians was the 4th time that I had gone to that place. I had left my body 3 times before, each time under a threat of death. The first time that I can remember was when I was 7 years old, and I was having my tonsils removed under ether. I was extremely frightened as I went under the ether, and I immediately found myself in a place with 2 angels who folded their wings around me and comforted me. The angel form was the childish projection onto the entities necessary to a child of 7 brought up in the Catholic Church. The second time was when I was 10 years old, and I had some disease, possibly tuberculosis, which made me very debilitated. I was in bed for 6 weeks or more. I used to wander off into this region when the room was quiet, nobody was present, when I had a high fever. The third time was when I was 22 years old, having 4 wisdom teeth removed under a local anesthetic. I became very frightened as the dentist had a chisel pointed right at my brain. The pain of it and the imaginary catastrophe of having the chisel slip and go into my brain put me into primary shock. I sweated and I became white and nauseated. The dentist saw this and gave me nitrous oxide. Under nitrous oxide, I went into the whirling space, a total experience of everything whirling. Sound, light, my body, the whole universe was whirling. I moved from that space suddenly into the space with the 2 guardians. At that time, they instructed me as to what I was going to be doing, or what I should do, and hadn't yet done. When I came back out of the nitrous oxide, my teeth had been pulled and I felt a huge and immense relief. Now I knew where I was going and what I was going to do. That was when I decided to go to medical school and learn more about the survival of myself and others. These memories, which were brought back during this long period of self-analysis after the accident, showed me the continuity of the space of these 2 guardians. I realized that this is a place that I can go to, and that presumably other people can go to under special circumstances. During those weeks, I resolved to get back to that place and to try to do it without the threat of death. I thought of the deep trance states and of using LSD to achieve this level of consciousness. Also, I reconstructed how the accident had occurred. I remembered that during World War II, when I was doing research on the bends, in brackets, the formation at high altitudes of bubbles that are released into the blood, close bracket, I discovered a foam made of detergent. I discovered that a foam made of detergent could be lethal. At the time, we were trying to find the pathways the bubbles took from the legs into the lungs. I injected foam into the leg vein of a dog and found that it went through the lungs into the brain. The detergent bubbles lowered the surface tension to the point where the bubbles could slip through the small capillaries of the lungs, go to the brain, and lodge there in the capillaries of the brain. With the bends, most of the bubbles were trapped in the lungs and caused a syndrome called chokes, CHOKES, in which the subject begins to feel tickling sensations in the chest, began to cough, and suddenly become very blue as the flow of blood through the lungs was stalled. The cure for chokes was merely to increase the pressure around the subject to the point where the bubbles collapsed. In the high altitude chamber, we did crash dives to atmospheres in order to collapse the bubbles. The important point is that the information had been stored in me 20 years before. I had forgotten that this information was there. In the throes of the grief and the guilt released by the second LSD session, I had apparently injected the foam. Something in me knew that this was a lethal act. The most frightening thing about this whole episode was the fact that part of me could use information stored in me to kill the rest of me. Insofar as I could remember, I was not consciously trying to commit suicide. At the time, it was literally an accident. When I realized that I had such lethal programs stored within me that they could destroy me if I gave in to them, or if I wasn't aware of their presence, I decided to do a much more thorough self-analysis and root out these programs. My analyst had warned me that such destructive tendencies existed. Apparently he was aware even though I wasn't. In fact, I had become so frightened before this episode that I had called my analyst and made an appointment to see him on the very next day after this accident happened. After my self-examination and the 6 weeks of convalescence, I paid him a visit, and I spent 2 hours working on this problem. I told him that I could remember, and through free association with him, recovered more of my memories. The only reason that I'm relating all of this very personal material is to illustrate the general principle. And here's the general principle. There can exist, in addition to the aware self, other hidden systems of control of the organism which can program thinking, can program feeling, can program action toward destruction of that particular organism. LSD can release these programs, can strengthen them, and can weaken the aware, surviving self to the point where there is a danger of suicide or of self-destructive activities. Therefore, examine yourself very carefully, do a very critical self-examination, and get help from someone else who knows you very well. If you have any hint of such programs, be sure that you place all the safeguards possible around yourself to prevent these programs from being activated under LSD to the point where you endanger your own body. My mistake was 2 LSD sessions too close together without adequate preparation for analysis between the 2 sessions and after the second session. The fact that I had to give the talk broke up the self-analysis period for the second session. Possibly if I had been able to carry out the analysis during a week following the second session, I might have been able to avoid this almost fatal episode. I suspect that these programs have been released in those cases in which the person under LSD ends up walking off a balcony or in front of a car. I do not think it is because of illusions or delusions projected onto the outside world, as much of it is a release of the self-destructive programs. During periods of intense emotion, which can be released by techniques discussed later as well as by LSD, such programs can be activated and can gain control of the whole system. Thus, included among the maps and the mapping of maps needed for successful navigation of the inner spaces, with any method as well as with LSD, are destructive programs. It is wise to explore these danger areas, not repress them. Explore them carefully and with proper help. One needs a guide in these areas who knows one very well and who can give one some understanding of them, thus preventing these destructive programs from taking over. I had no such guide, and I didn't use the one that was available. During the second session, my guide had left me. I had gone into these negative spaces without someone else to monitor me and to put me straight and to show me that I had activated these lethal systems. I had sensed that I should get to my analyst, but the episode occurred before I was able to make it. During the design of the subsequent experiments with LSD, I made sure that a good, solid person, well-grounded and well-centered, was available immediately in the environment of my experience. Anytime any kind of negative thinking happened, I could go to that person and I could straighten it out before it got to the point where I could not control it. I had learned many lessons from this episode, and as is said in scientific circles, no experiment is a failure. I had learned that death is not as terrifying as I had imagined it to be, and that there is another space, a safe place, beyond where we are now. Instead of being frightened off from further experimentation, I became intrigued, and I decided to explore this very region. I set up experiments using LSD in the solitude, isolation, and confinement tank, floating in the darkness and silence, freed from all inputs to my body from the external reality. In these experiments, I discovered other spaces, found other maps, and discovered relatively safe means of going into these places without having the lethal programs activated too strongly again. Luckily, my role as an explorer had not been endangered, but had been strengthened by this lesson. I say luckily because I did survive. I no longer feared the ultimate consequences of the negative programs. My fear of death or of leaving my body diminished. I had also discovered that my mission was to do exploring in this region. This meant I must clean up my life and fit myself further for continuing this work. This episode led to trouble with my professional reputation as a scientist. The rumor went around that the episode had happened as a result of taking LSD at the time, and that LSD had damaged my brain. LSD was found in my briefcase in the hospital. Immediately, the medical people attributed the whole episode to my having taken LSD in the hotel. This was wrong. The rumor that my brain had been damaged was reversed when I later went for a neurological examination and found that I was quite intact. I counted the number of ampoules of LSD present and was convinced that I had not used any in the in the hotel. There were 6 ampoules in the beginning, a full box, before the 2 LSD sessions, and there were 4 left. Insofar as I was able, I have given the facts and the lessons learned. Take this lesson for your own, reread the account, put yourself through it as if you were me. Absorb it, grok it in fullness. It may serve to get you through a tough place on a bum trip someday. And that concludes Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is called Return to the 2 Guides, Tank plus LSD. Till soon.